Thank you for coming. Okay. So thank you very much. We have 2 people so far. Oh boy. So welcome to our Saturday presentation. How's everybody doing today?
Good.
Good.
Hi, Nancy.
So today we're going to be, I guess this is our 4th online presentation. Today our topic is going to be the industrial home, or at least that's what the formal name was of the property, but most people here in Newmarket do it as the poorhouse. So we're going to spend the next 45 minutes to an hour talking about the property, its history, some of the things that maybe you didn't know were going on there at the poorhouse. Most people, when I've done the oral history interviews, a lot of people had no idea what was going on out there. They knew it was a beautiful building and it was well kept, but they had no idea what was going on. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and we'll talk a little bit about the controversy that exists long after its closing about where the bodies went and this sort of thing. So we'll just give them a few more minutes. We generally always have some late comers, so we'll see how many people show up. Let's just see now here how many we got so far. Oh, we only got 3 so far. We'll wait just a couple of minutes and see how many more people show up. I'm expecting to have about 15 to 20 people. So if people keep their word and they come, hopefully we'll be able to get started pretty soon. Hopefully, with doing it the 2 days a week, people will find something else to do besides the doom and gloom. Learn a little bit about our local history, which is always, I think, good. And the best part about it is it's free. So, we'll get started. So, as I say, today's topic is its proper name was the industrial home. And most people will remember it was located on the southwest corner of Eagle Street at Yonge Street. And probably when most people were growing up, it either was just getting ready to close or was closed, but it sat there vacant for many, many years before it was actually taken down. So that you can understand where it is. Eventually, when it was taken down, it was replaced by the courthouse. So the courthouse is now there, and with the grounds. And some of the, most of the grounds were sold off for houses. And, talk a little bit about that at the end, because, the question is, where is the old burial ground? Which nobody seems to be able to identify, where exactly the burial ground was and where all those bodies went. So, a lot of people, probably if you do a lot of reading, you know that in the early 1800s, people were expected to look after their own. So basically what happens is that if you had friends or relatives who were ill or were poor and had no place to live, you were expected to pitch in to help them out. And because of that, quite often the local towns or the local villages would be counted upon to help out as well. The interesting thing, and I think it's probably best to understand this right up front, if you take a look at the literature of the period, they'll tell you that they associated being poor with being both sickly and not particularly bright. And this was, this wasn't a lunatic fringe. This was a generally accepted belief that if, for instance, you were a poor person, you were likely poor because you were kind of backward, and that because you were poor, you probably would eventually become a health risk. So it's with that in mind that we take a look at the whole concept of building these industrial houses. So basically, what happened was that the province, because these were provincially run, the province got the idea that what it would do is it would build a whole series of these industrial houses throughout Ontario with the expected purpose of housing those people that they designated as being unfortunate or desolate. And the way you became unfortunate or desolate was, of course, to be poor or to be sickly, too sick to work, some sort of chronic disease, this sort of thing. So this was the concept. So the York County Council, which handled the entire area around Newmarket, went to the Ontario government and said, what we'd like to do is we'd like to have one of these properties placed within Newmarket proper, and this is exactly what they did. So in 1883, they began work on what was to be a 4-story brick building. For those people who remember the building, it was a very pretty building from the outside. It was a Queen Anne style. They spent a lot of money building it back then, as well as paying $4,500 to buy the farm that existed on the corner of Yonge and Eagle. They also paid nearly $18,000 to build the building, which today I guess doesn't sound like a lot of money, but back then was a great deal of money. And if you take a look at the building, even if you just remember it at the end, it was quite a nice looking building from the outside, and it was nicely taken care of. Now, however, it was nicely taken care of by people who were the residents of the property.
Richard, are you showing slides?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Oh, I will. I just wanted to give you some background before and then I will bring the slides up. That's all right. One of I should mention this, I guess, up front. One of the suggestions that was made, and I got a number of suggestions after the last few that I did, was that people didn't want to be muted. So they thought that the best part about my presentations when I do them live is that people can talk to me and this sort of thing. So not only have I not muted it, but there were people who complained that I went into the slides too early and that we needed to have a little talk before and get some background before we went into the slides. But thanks for reminding me of that. I better get into the slides pretty soon. So actually, maybe that's what we'll do now. I will we'll go into the slides and does everybody see the beginning of the slides? There's a slide up there with their goals on.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I've lost you.
Okay. So this is this particular picture that you see up here is a picture that was done by my Uncle George Loosby of the home, and as you can see, it was a nice looking property. It was actually 4 stories, and I'm going to use this for a second just to point out that, this picture to point out. You'll notice that as well as a ground floor, there was a group of rooms at the very, very top of the property, and some of the discussion that we have today will be about those rooms because this is where they put the people that they deem to be mentally unfit. And the best explanation or description I can give you of this particular area is that it was something out of Dickens. Because the people were deemed to be physically unfit to be with other people, they were locked up there. In many cases, there was the theory, and I started off the presentation by talking about the fact that they had a number of really weird theories according to what we believe today, but back then it made sense. One of their theories was that if you had mental illness, that the light was bad for you, and so many of these people would sit up in the rafters of this mansion completely in the dark. And one of the saddest moments of my life was I got the opportunity to go visit this property before they took it down. My Uncle George had been invited. He allowed me to tag along. And I could tell you from personal experience that upstairs part was just a horrible place. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But as you can imagine, locking somebody up in a room, which would be, of course, in the wintertime would be cold, and then the summertime would be very warm, with no light. It can be. If you didn't have mental issues at the beginning, you certainly did afterwards. Now, as they say, this was actually a four-story building, and it was Queen Anne, as I say. It was 2 interesting things. First of all, when the building was built, they called it the York County Industrial Home. But the corporation that owned this on behalf of the Ontario government, the corporation was called the Municipal Act for Poor Houses. So I think that probably is the first indication that their stated purpose of building these was not necessarily why they were building them. One of the difficulties that they had was, of course, there were a lot of poor people, and the towns didn't know what to do with them, and families didn't know what to do with them. And it became very convenient that what they would do is they would, you would be deemed as being poor, or as I say, of poor health, or maybe mentally not quite up to snuff, and then you would be whisked off to this building. I should tell you a little anecdote. When I was a little boy, my grandfather's favorite way to motivate me into going to school, being good in school, and working hard was that he said, if you are not good, we will send you to the poorhouse, which, of course, struck fear in my heart. Probably not a very nice thing to do, but this was a common thing that people here in Newmarket said, because it was known that it wasn't a very nice place, although I don't think people realized just how bad it really was. So let's just take a look at what I'd like to accomplish today. I'd like to learn you to learn a little bit about the history surrounding the industrial building, aka the poorhouse. I'd like to take a look at the purpose behind its creation and how these institutions grew, given the times that they found themselves in. Therein lies the interesting story, because if they had all only been used for the administering of the poor, probably they wouldn't have become such a horrible, horrible place. But their purpose started to expand, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along, to a point where it was a place where you sent people that you just didn't want to have around anymore. One can argue that nursing homes became that in many cases in the 60s and 70s. We're going to examine the creation and demise of these type of buildings, so why they were created, and then eventually why they disappeared. And they disappeared, as they say, because they, in many cases, were quite horrible places. And then finally, we're going to look at what remains of this sort of property. So we're going to, in the end, we're going to talk a little bit about the medical care system that we have. This particular building was replaced by York Manor. Many of you will probably remember York Manor, which was across the road. Then York Manor was replaced by Green Acres, and now there's all kinds of places where you can send people who are elderly or who need help to look after themselves. So this is what I plan to do today, hopefully. And usually what I like to do is I like to start with some maps to give you an idea. So this map that you see on the screen shows you this is the property. This is, of course, Eagle Street. This is the property here. As you can see, it's a large property. It was, in fact, a farm. As I said, it was purchased as a farm. And it was actually 50 acres of land. Now, what kind of farm was it? They grew cows. So those people who remember this building when it was still in a working property, you will probably remember that they had Holstein cows here. And those cows and the entire property were maintained by the people who lived there. Now, it's probably a good idea for me to explain one of the hints that this wasn't exactly what people thought it was. You'll notice that in the beginning, I've been referring to the property as the people who lived there, or the residents. Their official name were the inmates. They were called the inmates from the second that they opened the property. So, you kind of wonder, what the vision was of these people when they weren't guests, they weren't patients, they were called inmates. And when you take a look at the literature about who looked after this place and their own history that they've written about this place, they always refer to the people there as the inmates, never as the visitors, as the, anything else. So the name officially was, as I say, the County Industrial Home, and as I said, it was opened in 1883, and it wasn't until 1933 that they changed the name officially. It became the House of Refuge. The idea was that no longer were they going to sort of narrow the criteria for it being there from just people who were ill or poor. It would be the place where you could send people who had no other place to live. And again, people took this quite literally, and this is where you dumped anybody you didn't want out with you. Didn't matter really, as I said, what the official name was of it. this place was called the poorhouse. And, one of the, when I do the oral histories, one of the things that people mention who remember this from, back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, when it was going strong, was that the people apparently would sneak out of the building and would head to Yonge Street. Now, they couldn't get out of the property. What you think you will remember is they had about 8 or 9 foot high fence around it. So what these people used to do is they used to go and press their face against the fence and try and get people who are going by to stop. Sometimes to talk, sometimes to solicit a cigarette because they weren't allowed to smoke in the property. Even back when smoking was the thing to do, they weren't allowed to smoke, so they would bum cigarettes from people going by. So I guess it was kind of a sad place. And of course, they would tell their horror stories about how horrible it was. But they weren't very successful in getting people to stop. Not many people want to stop and talk to people about how horrible their life is. And also, too, a lot of people would have felt guilty.
I'm on this lecture thing right now.
Okay.
So anyway,
Okay.
we're up to, it wasn't until 1949 that it was changed again from the county home, or from the house of refuge to the county home for the aged. And then eventually in 1954, it became York Manor, and a new building was built. So in 1885, when it opened to the public, there were 147 inmates. This is according to their specific information. So there were 147 inmates, and you're going to love this, their weekly allowance for the maintenance of these people was $1.22. So their budget was that they would spend $1.22 on these people every week. So that means feeding them, clothing them, housing them, providing entertainment if they had intended to have entertainment, all of those things. What happened was, as you probably remember, in 1932, the government decided that it would institute old age pensions. So you would think that people would be better off. Not really, because what happened was that the pensions were made out to the home. So all the money from people's old age pensions went to the home, and they gave everybody an allowance of $2 a week to spend. However, they got $2 a week, but they couldn't leave the property, and they couldn't smoke, and they couldn't drink. So what were they going to spend the $2 on? That's always left with that sort of question. To say the farm was eventually increased as other people or other farmers sold their property. The property was purchased, and it was increased, and more buildings were built on the property, specifically for the working of the farm. So they built obviously barns and that sort of thing to house the cattle. You'd be happy to know that the farm was a great success, very profitable operation. It had a prize herd of Holstein cattle, as I mentioned before. The downside was that it was virtual slave labor in looking after this cattle. I mean, if you were there, this is where you were making your home, you were expected to look after the farm. That was your job. I guess in return for your $1.22 a week that they spent upon you. There's no doubt that the home did fulfill its purpose. Its purpose was to keep people away from the rest of us. It certainly did fulfill its purpose. As I say, in the beginning, the idea was that they would send people there who were poor, The idea was supposed to be that the people went there and they would have a much better life. History tells us that that wasn't the case. They didn't have a better life. There were more people trying to get out of the place than certainly wanting to go in. As I said, I referenced several times, this was the place where you sent people that you didn't want. So let's say, for instance, you had we'll start with a neighbor. Let's say you had a neighbor, and your neighbor wasn't really doing a very good job of either raising his family or keeping his house or his property up in order. What you could do is you could go to the committee that ran this place, and you could petition that this guy be taken from his home and put into the industrial home or to the poorhouse. Because the home was a money-making proposition, they would quite often do this, particularly if they could find other people who felt likewise. It'd be nice to get this guy off my street and move him in there. Now we get to the other side of it. Let's say, for instance, and there's always, when I use this example, people go, "Oh, it's a horrible idea." But let's say, for instance, you were pretty much sick and tired of your mother-in-law. What you could do is you could go secretly to them and say, my mother-in-law, she's not with it anymore. She's just not able to cope. So I would like to petition to move my mother-in-law into the home. And again, the place was filled with people who were put into the home with very questionable reasoning as to why they were put into the home. So I say, people were put in there supposedly because they had some mental issues. People were put in there because apparently the government thought that they couldn't cope out in real life, whether it be financially or whatever, because of their health. So they moved them in there. So the worst thing that could possibly happen to you would be to get older and to be a burden on your family, in which case, you stood a very good chance of having a hearing, and you could very well go into there. Now, once people got into there, and as I referred to before, they spent $1.22 a week on you. And we know this very well because of what's happening now. People would go in there and they would get sick. And when they got sick, not only would they die, but other people would die because they would get the illness as well. It wasn't really until the 1930s, 1940s that the place had its own designated doctor. So basically what would happen is if somebody got sick, they would call a local doctor, and the local doctor would decide, they would take turns going to visit the inmates. But usually by the time they went to visit the inmates, it was too late anyway. We know, and we're going to refer in more detail to this a little later, but we know that approximately 1,100 people died in the property from the time that it was first set up until it was eventually closed. It was eventually closed in 1959, but it sat empty for a long, long time. But it was effectively closed in 1959. So about 1,100 people died there, not all adults. And as I say, in the end, we'll talk about what happened to those bodies, because that's the great mystery. So illness within the property was a problem. A lot of people died. And when people died, they needed more people moved in there so that they could maintain the profitability of the operation. So they were always looking for new ideas, new people that they could possibly import into the place. One of the saddest stories, and when I was doing research on this, I first did this presentation in Toronto. It was like a 2.5-hour presentation, so I was a little tired after that. But one of the things that I found out, which is just boggled my mind, many of you probably will remember when you were growing up that, sometimes what would happen is a young lady would get pregnant, and the parents would send them off to visit their grandmother or their aunt, or at least this is what they would tell the neighbors. So they're off visiting. Essentially what they want to do is they want to get them out of public eye. Well, somebody came along and said, you know, a really good idea would be to send them to this, to the industrial home, to the poorhouse, because, you know, we can put them in there. It's relatively cheap. They can go in there, they can have the baby, and then they can reappear magically. And the idea was initially that that they would be able to use the home as a place to send what they used to like to call back then wayward women to have their baby. Now, the sad part of it was that in reality, when you went in for the interview, they would ask you two questions. First one is, do you want her back? So you had the ability, if you were really upset with your daughter, you had the ability to say, no, not really. And that would then become where your daughter would live. They also would say, do you want the baby? If you didn't want the baby, the people in there, the organization, the Ontario government, would tell you that they will try and find a place to send, adoption, to send the baby. However, in reality, what we discovered from the reports was that a very high percentage of the babies that were born there didn't survive. And one of the mysteries that comes out of this property is that there are people who claim, although I haven't really seen the evidence, but who claim that one of the things that they did there was that when they had a backlog of babies, then conveniently children would die in childbirth. And we know that a number of the bodies that they were able to ascertain were on the property were in fact infants. So, take that for what you wish. As I say, the property was closed in 1959. The buildings themselves were demolished in 1978, and the land was used to erect the provincial courthouse, which is there, and the land registry office, which was moved from Main Street here in Newmarket, and that was all done in 1980. So in 1980, the new courthouse went in, and the building was taken down. Now, just to give you an idea of what it was like inside, as I say, I went to visit the property when it was still there. It had been derelict for a while. There's certainly no doubt about that when I went to visit it. And the first thing that struck me when I went in was how dark it was. People had written on the wall in the rooms, pretty much suicidal notes, I guess you would say, trying to reach out to people. I guess if you were not a very well-behaved person, granted you didn't have to go out and work on the farm, but you also didn't get out of the room. So that wasn't a very good thing. But what really struck me was, I say, that top floor. That top floor is where they put the people who they deemed to have mental issues. When I went up to that floor, the people closed the blinds to try and reproduce what it was like up there, and it was eerie. I like light. I think we all like light, and I just can't imagine spending, most of my days in a closed-in area, essentially an attic, in the dark, which is essentially what they did. And I remember saying, it looks like there's you've got some sort of infestation of animals, because the walls look like they have been are currently being eaten. And they said, oh, no, this is what the inmates did. If you gave them a spoon or a knife, they tried to dig their way out. Many apparently would try and scratch their way out of the building, or try. So it was a very horrible situation. And of course, this was going on in Newmarket, but nobody knew about this, I guess. And I should emphasize, because this is something that I think is important to understand. These buildings were all over Ontario. It wasn't as if Newmarket was better or worse than any place else. They were all over Ontario. This was the way society thought back in those days. I have an article coming out on the Great Depression, and one of the things that strikes you about the Great Depression was that when the people went to the federal government and said, you know, you've got to help us. You know, we've got people who are starving to death. We got people who have no homes, no place to work. The federal government said, you know, it's not the government's responsibility to look after you. The responsibility to look after you are local charities and your own family.
You almost have to close it.
You know, it's not up to us to look after. So, you know, it wasn't most of the social welfare that we have, including, I might add, organized medicine, or I guess you'd say provincial run medical clinics, didn't exist back then. So you could really disappear in one of these places. And as I say, I don't think you were very well looked after. So what did they do with the people that were left in there? Well, the people were sent over across the road to York Manor. Many of you will remember York Manor being on the north side of the street. Also, you know, it was on the west side of the street, but it was on the north side of Eagle Street. And it was, first of all, built, and they spent a fairly hefty amount of money building it. It was built for $1 million. That's including over the years, all of the extensions that they put on it. We know that in 1970, they spent $750,000 to increase the capacity of the property up to 225. So York Manor in 1970 held 225 inmates in there. The York Manor became the property of York Region when York Region was created. So it became the property of York Region under their jurisdiction, and it was administered by a staff of 150 people. As opposed to when the industrial home was running it, there were 20 people. So the interesting thing is that it was estimated that in the industrial house, when they were at peak, they had nearly 400 people, and they were being administered by 20 people. York Manor had a capacity of 225, and they had 150 people who worked there. So a little bit of difference. I think you're getting a little better care if, you know, at that point. And of course, medicine had changed. I mean, over the years, and you know, it's fine for me to say this now, sitting here in the 21st century, but people didn't know about these things. I mean, people did not know about social welfare. I mean, it was understood that, well, in fact, I go back to my own grandfather. I did a series of extensive oral history interviews with him, and I can remember him, and I don't think he was a particularly unfeeling man, but I remember him saying, well, the fact is that if you can't look after yourself, if you get sick, if you're poor, if there's something wrong with you, your relatives have to step forward. If they don't step forward, then unfortunately we're going to have to wash our hands of you, because it's not society's purpose to look after you. So we've come a long, long way since then. And of course, the homes reflect this. So as the per diem rate for inmates, and they still called them inmates at this time, the per diem rate for inmates was $13.50 in 1957. So that means every day they were expected to spend at least $13.50 on each person. So when you think that they were at one time spending $1.22 a week, a little bit better. I can't even imagine what they could feed you for $1.22 a week. And the annual budget in 1957 for running the home was $3 million. So you can see, big difference. Now, York Manor, I don't know how many people ever got a chance to go in York Manor, but York Manor was very modern and very comfortable place to be. But I can still remember people who were in there telling me and telling my family, anybody I guess that was listening to them, that it wasn't a very nice place. It left a lot to be desired. And still, at this time, people were still keeping particularly their grandmothers and grandfathers at home. It wasn't really until the 70s that we started to move to a model where we had the nuclear family, where mom and dad and the kids were home, and they had to, your parents had to find some other alternative place to live because you couldn't come and live with them. But one thing, the government did a study in 1985, and they determined that they needed to change the way they were doing business. The report talked about the fact that the doorways and corridors are too narrow, so if you happen to be in a wheelchair, you were unable to navigate through the building. They said that the residence rooms were so crowded that it quite often was necessary to put 3 or 4 people in a room that should probably be used for 1, possibly 2 people. This is the thing that gets me. There was no closet space for people, and the plumbing and ventilation was insufficient for human existence. Kind of scary. And we're talking about the York Manor. So you can imagine what the industrial home was like, because York Manor was seen to be the pinnacle of a care facility. As a result of the whole process of the report, what happened was that the government decided that even though they had the capacity to have 225 beds within the facility, that they would reduce it to 160, because that was deemed to be more humanitarian than trying to maintain 225 people. This also resulted in the plans to build another place. As a result of the report, in May of 1985, they decided that they would build 2 new homes in the region and phase out York Manor. Many of you probably will remember this. At this point, they built Green Acres, and they also built a property in Richmond Hill called the Metro Toronto Home for the Aged. And they took the people who were inmates at York Manor, and they divided them up depending on where you came from, whether you went to Richmond Hill or whether you stayed here in Newmarket and went to Green Acres. Now, one of the things I probably should have mentioned was the people who were in Newmarket, both in the industrial house and then York Manor, didn't necessarily come from Newmarket. Because it was a provincially run property, they could send you to either one of these places, no matter where you live. As long as you were from Ontario, they could send you to these places. So quite often, not only were you, and I'm assuming that this was the case, not only were you locked up, not only were you performing tasks on a farm with no pay, probably very little food, or the minimum of food and medical care, but you were, in many cases, you probably weren't at home. You probably, Newmarket probably really wasn't your home. So you were in an area where you had no idea, in many cases, probably where you were or what was happening around you. Now, this was convenient for the relatives, and again, this is sad to say, but this was convenient for the relatives. In a brochure from the industrial home, they said, the ideal situation is that if you happen to be located in southern Ontario and you can send your parents to Newmarket, and of course, because it's a long distance to commute, you don't really have to come here. Okay. So basically, you could send the people to Newmarket, and then your excuse for not visiting was, hey, they're a long way from where I am. It's not convenient for me to go visit. So, and this is one of the reasons why and in a second we'll get to it, was one of the reasons why I think there was a higher rate of death and a high rate of despair in the place, is that these people were left all by themselves. I know my mother was in one of these places for her last 6 months, and I was absolutely, and this was, 2000 or 2100, but I was surprised at how few people actually got visits. How many people were just sitting there day after day with nobody visiting. It was really, really sad. As I say,
Richard.
Yes.
Richard. I've been kicked in and out of this presentation, so I hope it's not repeating something. But is York Manor there at the bottom right of your slide?
No. Sorry. This is the picture. This picture is the industrial house.
Right.
This is empty. This picture is before they built York Manor. Actually, what we'll do is we'll take a look at some pictures. That's a good idea.
Oh, perfect. Because I just Googled York Manor. I do remember it. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, great.
It was across the road. It was on the west side of the street, on the north side of Eagle Street, where I guess they've got the place, which is the hospice, is located there now, I believe. So this will give you sort of an idea of what we're looking at here. What we have here is all the properties along Yonge Street at that time, and what we're looking at here is when this map was done, you see York Manor is across the road. At this point, the building was derelict. It was just still sitting derelict on the. So here's, just so you know, this is York Manor right here. This is the industrial home, and it was still sitting there. It sat there. I don't know if you were in here when I was talking about this, but it sat there occupied until '59, and it stayed until the late '70s, derelict. So in other words, it was sitting there, but it wasn't really being used for anything at all until they eventually took it down. So this is sort of a map to give you an idea. Sorry, I've gone from one extreme to the other. The complaint was that I showed too many slides, and now I'm not showing enough. This is another picture from 1957, which shows you an aerial view of the property. As you can see, it was a fairly large farm. So the province made quite a bit of money because, of course, first of all, it put the courthouses in there, but second of all, it was able to sell all the remaining farm land for development. So developers came in and built the houses there and whatever. So anyway, so this is, as I say, this is a 57, give you an idea. And as you can see, I always like looking at these pictures because Newmarket was relatively undeveloped. I remember this. I'm an old dude. So I can remember when on the west side of Yonge Street, it was relatively undeveloped. I can remember when they built Glenway. So that shows you how old I am. Let's take a look at some photos. This photo was taken in front of the property. This is from a brochure, and the brochure is interesting because what you see is this cute little boy and a little girl. But from what I understand, from what they tell us, this wasn't the case. First of all, they usually would not be out on the property walking around, just standing around. Second of all, you definitely wouldn't have people in suits. So, but it was propaganda. This is a close-up of the house. As you see it, beautiful place. One thing I will give them credit for, when they built this place, is they say it's a Queen Anne, what they call the Queen Anne architecture. But the horrible part, as I say, is that there were people who were living up in this top part here. This is where they put the people who had they deemed to have mental issues. And because the theory of the day, as I said, was that people with mental issues are particularly susceptible to light. You may notice that that it's shuttered. So it'll be, just imagine the summertime it would be very, very hot, and in the wintertime it would be cold. as well as that you'd be sitting in the dark. And you'd be separated. So you wouldn't have people to talk to. You'd be separated from other people. But the property looked nice. You know, it was nicely maintained, again, by the inmates. This is another picture of the property. So most people who grew up with this, when this building was still standing, were always impressed with the architecture, were always impressed with the grounds. Nobody had any idea what was going on inside. And I remember as a child asking my mother, why don't you ever see any people out, like sitting on chairs or stuff like this? And she said, she said, most of these people are too ill to be able to go outdoors, which is probably what they told them. Again, beautifully manicured property, beautiful trees. Because this was a farm, of course, behind this building, and I don't have really a good picture other than, you know, as I say, the maps that I showed you, the aerial views. I don't really have a picture of the farm part of it, but the front was very pretty. They had over on this side, and of course, you can just see the tip of it. They had a little orchard. Many of you probably will remember when the little orchard was there. Just to put this into perspective, the next property over would have been the Quaker Meetinghouse. And it always amazed me because the Quakers were particularly socially vibrant. They you know, they were always looking for the ills of society, and I'm really surprised that they didn't step up their efforts to do something about what was going on here. But I guess maybe they didn't know. Maybe nobody knew. It's only really, that's one thing about history. It's really only recently that we've sort of gotten an idea of some of the things that went on. This picture is good. I was kind of hoping that you'd see the front door. As I say, very nice property. This is taken in 1906, or just after 1906. So if you were coming along Yonge Street, this is what you would see. You would see that long, winding. You see a little bit of it here, but long, winding, leading driveway into the property, and it looked like everybody was really happy here. You can see a few of the buildings at the back, which were part of the farm. This is a picture of the building it. Again, most of these pictures are pictures that were taken back then, so they're maybe not great condition, but this is the building, the property. So they certainly built a nice place, and I think probably the idea initially was that it was going to be a pretty nice place. Again, I'm always intrigued by the fact that, you know, they had fountains, they had, so I guess this was sort of a facade, because it's part of my presentation in Toronto when I originally did this. And for those people who have arrived late, I originally did the presentation in Toronto back in the 80s. And at that time, there was still some people who were still alive who either worked there or knew of the property. And they said that one of the reasons why it looked so nice is because if you were a special inmate, if you were very well behaved, you were given the detail of looking after the garden. So the gardens were well looked after. Because they didn't have to pay you to do it, you know, I guess they could afford to have really nice gardens. The entrance to the home, as I said, let's look at that. Boy, I got lots of pictures. This is the courthouse that's there now. Everybody probably remembers this place. So we know that, just getting back, we know the Green Acres officially opened in 1955. It had 400 beds, and it had 600 full and part-time staff. So basically, you know, you've got at least one person or one staff per person that is there, you know, as opposed to 20 people looking after all those people who were on who were at the industrial home originally. The let's get to a couple of the questions that remain. First of all, the province's story that they always told was that, well, actually, it was three parts. First of all, is not many people died. This is what the story. They said not many people died at the property. Deaths were fairly rare, and when people did die, their family would come and get them, and they would be buried in family plots. The difficulty was that turned out to be a lie. One of the people who attended the presentation I did in Toronto, at the end came to a microphone and said, was waving a book at me. And she said, my grandmother was the lady who looked after the books at the industrial home. She looked at, this is the death book, if you want to put it that way. This is the book keeping track of everybody who died. There were nearly 1,100 of them. There are only 200 people who are identified as what happened to them. The rest of these people have disappeared. We don't know where they are. And the gentleman who was on the stage, who was from the Ontario government, said, as governments tend to do, I'd be certainly happy to look into that for you and get back to you. Of course, knowing that we weren't going to have any more meetings, and so he was not going to have to get back to anybody. But this was what they said. I think the fear was two things. First of all, the fear was that people would start to wonder where these bodies went, and they would start to think, they probably buried the people. And if they buried the people, where is the cemetery? So anyway, this lady who was in the crowd, and I give her credit. She's asked me in further presentations I do not to mention her, because apparently, the government, as I explained to you in a few seconds, some of the things that she's done, the government isn't necessarily greatly enamored with her. But what she did was she thought to herself, I think I'm being put off. So what she did was she decided that she would, because she had the names of the people, and she did a search to see in area cemeteries if she could find any mention of the people, which she couldn't. What she did find was that an awful lot of people, their bodies were given to the University of Toronto to dissect for the medical students. So we do know that a number of the people who died, small number, but a number of the people that died, their bodies were given to the medical schools. Now, as well, we should keep in mind that the people who were buried, and we know they were buried there. I mean, there is no doubt that there were people buried there. We know that the people that were buried there probably were buried there because they were poor. So it was kind of like what would you call it, a poverty cemetery. And there would be no markers, because obviously they didn't do that with markers. One of the things that's interesting about the book, and I was able to not only take a look at the book, but the lady was very nice in sending me about 4 or 5 pages of the book, just so I could have a feel for what was going on. And the 4 or 5 pages that were sent to me, there were a huge number of baby deaths, which seemed to me, maybe, I remember my mother, who believed that everybody was good and kind and would never do anything bad, said, well, you have to understand, back then, childbirth was a major thing, and an awful lot of children died in childbirth. So that might be the case. But we know that the area, and I'm closing my eyes because I'm really challenged as far as directions, on the south side of the where the current courthouse is, on the south side of that, there's an area of about, I'd say about 8 or 9 feet, the whole length of the property, before the building next door. There's a hedge, and there's a building next door. We know that area contains bodies. We know that. When I did this presentation here in Toronto, here in Newmarket, people said to me, well, we don't do that in Newmarket. And which gave me the idea for a presentation I did on cemeteries in Newmarket, when I was able to explain to people that we actually have 13 cemeteries in Newmarket. Only 3 of them are above ground, or in other words, that you know they're there. If you take a look at the Christian Baptist Church, if you take a look at the church, the St. John's Church, they both had burials underneath the parking lot. They didn't bother moving the people. The thought was that why move the people if there is a parking lot on top of them? You know, they're safe underneath the parking lot. So there's actually 13 in Newmarket, and about every 3 or 4 months, I post on the History Hound a map for those people who are interested in going out on their own and taking a look of the 13 cemeteries in Newmarket. For your interest, the Quaker burial ground on Yonge Street is not one of those 13 because the Quakers do not consider the burial ground a cemetery. And you know, at some point I will do a presentation on the Quakers, and you will understand why. But they just don't believe, and they go out of the way of saying it's not a cemetery; it's a burial ground, and so it's not one of the ones that are included. But getting back to the industrial home, we know people are buried there. I have no way of knowing how large the cemetery was because of the fact that the property went back almost to, well, you know, as they say, it was 50 acres. So, and they purchased more land as time went on. So we believe that over the 50 acres, there's probably other burials. And I would assume that probably the developer, when he built those houses, would have an idea of where those burials would be. So one would assume that given those cases, any place where you see green space, that's probably because the builder was made aware of the fact that there was a very good chance that there are bodies buried there. The other thing too is, as I say, you know, if you take a look at the period of operation of the industrial house or home, it went through 2 periods where we had situations like we have now, where we had a large number of people dying. Certainly, you know, 1918 to 1920, we had Spanish flu, and Newmarket alone had, you know, thousands of people who were critically ill and passed. So people who are all stuck in a home with virtually no medical care, you know, there's probably a lot of people who died. There's probably, you know, the lady who waved the book at me and said there's 1,100 here, she made the point that there may be many, many more that they didn't bother recording who died. So we know that there's a real mystery here. And that's a mystery I think that probably will remain unanswered. You know, one would think that eventually we would come to some sort of an understanding of what happened, but there's still people who don't have any idea what happened to the bodies at the Alexander Muir School. You know, they built a nursing home, and the government said, yeah, we moved those bodies. And when the heritage people here in Newmarket said, oh, we would like to honor these people, where did you move them? They said, well, unfortunately, we don't have very good records, so we don't know where we put them. This was asked to them approximately 4 months after supposedly they moved them, so I find it hard to believe they don't know where they put them. But one of the people that I had as a client told me that he was involved in the demolition of Alexander Muir, and he told me that his family had, or his company had in fact brought in concrete and had put concrete over all the places that they found bodies. So they may still be there, you know. As long as they didn't dig them up and do something disrespectful, I suppose there's not much we can do. As I say, we've got a number of cemeteries here in Newmarket, old cemeteries here in Newmarket that are paved over or are being used for other things. So I guess it's not unheard of. So we may never find out what happened to all those bodies at the industrial house. As well, I think it would be worthwhile finding out as well whether they could put up some sort of memorial. There was a memorial. Many people some of you may remember, there used to be a memorial, a little plaque that was up on the grounds, even after they built the courthouse. But surprisingly enough, after that lady confronted the government person who was on the stage to dais with me, that disappeared. I went in one day to the courthouse under the guise of doing a story, and I said, I really would like to find out what happened to the Karen or to the marker that was there. And the gentleman who was a guard says, well, as long as I've been here, and I've been here for about 20 years, I've never seen a Karen. So he was very kind. He went and asked around to people who had been there longer. And one person said, yeah, I remember the government coming and taking it down. So I guess they took it down. I've been over there recently, and I welcome anybody who wants to go for a walk once we can get out and walk around to take a look. But I couldn't find it. I know where it was supposed to be, and it wasn't there. So unless they've moved it to some place and it's surrounded by trees or something like that, I really don't know. But nobody seemed to know where it went. I think it'd be nice, because I think that I'm one of those people who believes that we should put up plaques to document our past, not just the really happy things that happened in Newmarket, but real history as it was, so that we remember our past, the good and the bad. I noticed that Nancy had a question. Sorry, Nancy.
Oh no, that was from before. I'm sorry I didn't turn it off.
Okay. Sorry.
One later when you're done.
Okay. So so this is sort of my ramble about the industrial house. Generally, when I did this here locally in Newmarket, we did an hour and a half, almost 2 hours of it. Many more slides. At that point, I had borrowed slides from another person, and they had pictures of the inside, but unfortunately I don't have those pictures anymore. I had to get those slides back, and I had shown them on the understanding that it was a one-time only sort of thing. I think now you'll find that the topic is a little bit touchy, because I would imagine if you own a house in that area, you might wonder, about these things. It is one of those places that I go and I do. Every 2 years I do a history walk geared to ghosts, and it's one of the places that we walk. And it can be eerie, particularly not quite as eerie as when the building was there. When the building was there, it was eerie. When the building was there, and I was just starting doing the history walks, we used to go there, and I remember asking several people, are you sure that this place is closed? Because there were lights, particularly in the upper level of the building. There were lights that you could see. And the answer always was, no, it's completely locked up. We've got security that have locked it down, so there's nobody in there. So if it was as horrible as people tell us it was, and of course, we don't have, at least I don't know of anybody who has stepped forward and said, my relatives were in there, and this is their story. We do have people who have worked there. I did a oral history interview with a lady who was a nurse there, and this was back in the 70s. And so I did an interview with her, and while she didn't want to really get into details, she said to me, she had heard my presentation, and she said to me, which just boggled my mind, she said, all the horrible things that you said went on, you don't even have a clue of how bad it was. It was really, really, really bad. And she said, if you're dying and you realize that this is where you're going to die, it's really, really, really sad. I think probably the thing would be, your two choices were to work on the farm or stay inside. And when they had, imagine during the Spanish flu, when about 1 out of every 3 people died, basically, who got it. You can imagine how many people would have died within that institution. Anyway, that's the industrial home. I'll open it up to questions if people have questions or comments. just before you do, I remind you I'll be back on Wednesday. I've got a couple possibilities for what we will do on Wednesday. One of them is to do the canal because of the new interest in the canal with Mr. Mulock's house being purchased and the promotion. I might do a presentation on the Mulock property and talk about Mr. Mulock specifically. I did the article in the paper, or I should say online, for Newmarket today. And while most of my articles get between 1,200 and 1,400 views, that one was, I think at last count, is about 11,000 people who have looked at that article. There's a real fascination with Sir William Mulock and famous people who came to visit. And I just recently, you may have noticed if you take a look at my posts on my Facebook page, I just recently posted the article from the paper talking about the funeral of in the 40s of Sir William Mulock. When you think back, nowadays, you've got wall-to-wall security. You probably would never ever have a public figure, out walking among the people, and yet 3 prime ministers attended Mulock's funeral here in Newmarket. They walked up Main Street. 2 of the pallbearers were former prime ministers of Canada who carried the coffin. So, and security was basically the local police. And for those people who grew up when I did back in the 50s, the local police, while they were wonderful human beings, I don't think they were probably the type of security you would expect to have for a prime minister and for all the important people who attended. So that in itself, I think, is an amazing thing that all these people came here and that there was virtually no security. And I should say, at his funeral, the current prime minister at the time also attended and walked the entire length of Main Street up to the cemetery on North Main for the service. So maybe that's what we'll do on Wednesday. My Wednesdays are Wednesday nights. They're at 7 o'clock. So if you have an opening at 7 o'clock, I welcome you to join us. Okay, anybody have any questions?
Richard, I was wondering about the Alexander Muir thing that you mentioned about the school.
Yeah.
Why would there be bodies at the school? I don't know.
That was originally a church. Before it was a school, it was a church.
Oh, that's why.
It was a Methodist church. And people were buried there.
Okay, that makes sense.
So, and the bodies had always been there. Everybody always knew the bodies were there. I happened to be I'm trying to think of a nice way of putting it. I'm a disturber. When I found out that they were doing the demolition there, I gathered the forces to find out what they were doing with the bodies. And, we got stonewalled. I mean, there's no nice way of putting it. We got stonewalled. Everybody got stonewalled. The press got stonewalled. The press came from Toronto and from other places in Ontario to ask what was happening with the bodies. And the patent answer was, well, they're all going to be moved. They're going to be, taken away. We won't have an issue. And as I say, I spoke to the people who did the demolition job, and they said they weren't moved. What we did was we opened it all up and we put about 2.5 to 3 foot of concrete over them, and then we buried it again. And the gentleman, which really shocked me, the gentleman had a little bit of a sense of humor. He said, and also if you intend, because my mother was still alive at that time, and if you intend to put your mother into the Alexander Muir, I would suggest that you don't go into the north wing of the place, because that's where the cemetery was, which just freaked me out. He thought it was funny. I cringed. But I had the same, when I do the walking tours, we always stop at the Christian Baptist Church and walk over. And I never tell people. What we do is we walk around to the end, to the back of the church in the parking lot, and I say, you are walking over people. There are people buried under here. Same thing as I say with St. John's underneath the parking lot at St. John. But you know, the other thing too, you have to keep in mind, and this is something that a lot of people don't think about. As we build subdivisions, we're unearthing bodies. The standard procedure back, you know, certainly up until about the 1930s here in Newmarket, if somebody died, they would be buried on the local property. There was no law till the 1930s that you could bury somebody on your property. And so a lot of, you know, particularly in the Stonehaven area, where Stonehaven was built on farms that had been in the same family for, you know, for several hundred years, they found all kinds of bodies, because that's what you did. You buried people there. Keep in mind, not as much in the 19th century, but in the 1800s, if somebody died, there usually was not a minister attached to the church here in Newmarket. They traveled around. So you can imagine, you know, your Aunt Martha has died in July, and they're telling you that they're kind of hopeful that in the next 3 or 4 weeks, the rotating ministers would be back in town and you could have a service. You're not going to wait. You know, what you do is you put them on and many of you are maybe a little bit older, you may remember this. The standard procedure was that you would dress the body up, you would put it usually on the dining room table. You dress the house in black. People would come to the house, would view the body, and then the body would be buried. And whether it was buried here in a cemetery or it was buried on your property, if you had a farm or you had a large property, very good chance it was buried on the property. So I guess that a long answer to a nice short question. Nancy, yes.
Yeah. Is Sheila still on? Because she remembers cutting.
I'm here.
Yeah, you were saying you remember cutting through there.
Oh, yeah.
Was it really eerie when you went?
Yeah, always very dark and scary, and it wasn't kept, of course. So there was long grass, and yeah, real scary. But you know what? We also remember, and it could be wrong, that it was part of like an armory for a while. Because I had a friend that was in the Air Cadets, and they used to use part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, this is what I was saying. Is it spent a long time being empty, but they did every once in a while. They would reopen it to, and you're right. The armory, the people involved with the armory were one of the groups that were there. I can remember going there every once in a while for historical meetings. Now, the key was you're going to be on the ground floor. You're going to be the armory was using the outbuildings that were still there for the farm, but there was nobody going upstairs. I can guarantee you they would have a very hard time explaining blood on the walls on the top floor. It'd be very difficult to explain to the public.
Wow.
Yeah. So Richard, where would the wayward women come from? Would they just be fairly local women?
They could be local, or they could be. The industrial homes grew from pretty much, probably around Georgian Bay, right down to the border with the United States.
Okay.
And as I say, the government found it ideal putting people in homes that were a long way away from their family.
Right.
First of all, there wasn't anybody coming to visit to see what was happening. As I say, later on, of course, I guess things may have gotten a little better, but I just cannot fathom, and I keep mentioning it, how you could sustain somebody for $1.22 a week. Feed them, clothe them, house them, entertain them. I don't know how you could possibly do that and pay the staff. That's not.
But that might be part of the explanation why not many people in town knew what was going on, because many of them may not have been locals.
Well, I think probably what happened was, I'm going to use my grandfather as an example, because this is one of the things. I mean, Nancy, you know me, so I sometimes when I get a burr under my saddle, I get a little intense. And in doing interviews with him, this is one of the things I said. I said, to him, you lived in this town from 1886. This place was here. You're telling me you had no idea that this stuff was going on, that this place was as horrible as it was? And he said, no. He said, we lived in fear because we thought there, but for the grace of God, we could end up there. And, it's easy to talk about it, but it's hard to realize. Could you imagine one of your neighbors, or even, let's just say, for instance, your dear brother Terry, deciding that he would like the house, and so secretly going and having you committed?
Yeah, he's probably thought of it a few times.
I think but the other thing too, which I think is particularly striking, was the unwed mothers. That brought an element to it that I found really, really hard. I mean, again, probably because, and you always have to be very careful. I was taking a look at it from the point of view now, as opposed to what it was like then. I know that my mother lived next door to, when she was a child, had somebody on her street who became pregnant, and the parents no longer spoke of the daughter. She didn't exist anymore. And so, I guess these things happen. But to go to a meeting at the industrial home and say, no, we have no problems if you keep her. We're not particularly attached to her. We got more children, I guess, so we're not particularly attached to her. That just boggles my mind. But I guess those things happen. Same thing as, when this lady was talking about how they gave the body for research. Because there were no relatives, or essentially the relatives didn't want the body, and they didn't give them. I should mention, they didn't give it to the university. The university paid for it, $50.
Yeah.
So this was a profit-making situation. Yeah. And the other thing too, which is I thought was kind of interesting too, is that the gardens around Newmarket, so the public gardens, were quite often looked after by the inmates there. What would happen was that the institution would rent these people out. Now, keep in mind, nobody who put the relatives in there or their loved ones in there was paying anything for them to be in there.
Wow.
So I guess the institution thought, well, because you're not paying, you don't really have a right to tell us what we do.
Rick, have you ever seen the Wellington County Poorhouse?
Yes. Yeah.
It's actually a museum now. You can go for tours there.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, there's a lot of people who say it's a real shame they took down that building.
Yeah.
That building would be an incredible building because it was a beautiful looking building from the outside. And they would have to probably do a couple hundred exorcisms inside for it to be able to be used for the public. But I think it would be nice to have. Also, too, I think, and you know how I feel about this, I think it's important that we talk about our history, both good and bad. And I think to have that place still there and talk about how far we have come from the prevailing views back then. You may remember, maybe you attended, I was involved in the presentation we did on the home children. All the children that were sent over here to Britain because either the government didn't want them in Britain or the parents didn't want them in Britain, so they sent them over here. That was an amazing story. And what made it even more amazing was that when we took a look at the records, we found that there were 150 children sent to Newmarket.
Wow.
So 150, and there still are, I don't know if there's probably, well, they might still be alive, but they might probably be in their 90s. But there were still people that came out to that presentation, and this was about 4 or 5 years ago. There were still people who came out who were home children. One of them brought in a picture of the place where he lived, because the people, of course, adopted you, but you became a slave. And they could keep you until you reached the age of consent. So if you got a young one, you could have them as your slave all that time. But he showed me that where he stayed had a bed and over the bed was a big ring, and he said that he, every night, so that he wouldn't run away, they would put handcuffs on him and chain him to the wall. What freaked me even more was that I said to this gentleman, so what did you do once you got out of this? And he went to school and he became a judge. So,
Wow.
but the reason he was there was because his family had decided that because he was poor, he likely was feeble-minded and probably disease-ridden. And so the British thought that the best thing to do is to send all these people to the colonies.
Jeez.
Go ahead.
Any other questions?
Richard,
Hi.
did these, I'm Rosemary with Roy.
How you doing?
Did these poor homes become Ontario hospitals? Like in North Bay?
Yes, a number of them were converted. What happened was that what happened in Newmarket happened in all of them.
Yeah.
They became socially unacceptable. So what they decided to do, and as I say, there was a huge report that was done in the early 1980s, in which case is a scathing report talking about how bad these places were, and they pretty much decided that they would get rid of them.
Yeah.
And close them down. Now, some closed immediately. Some lasted a little bit longer. The story that I was always told about Newmarket was that they decided that it was one of the worst ones, and so they wanted to do something. They already had built York Manor, but the big, and some of them, like, for instance, if you take a look at the Green Acres now has become a nursing home, or a long care home, I guess is what they like to be called, long care home. I worked there. I worked there for a summer with a number of colleagues when I was going to high school, and it was bad then. I can't imagine what it would have been. I have a scar on my hand where I got stabbed by one of the people living there, one of the residents living there, and because one of my jobs was to deliver the food to them. So I said to this lady, why did you do this? I said to the doctor, why did this person stab me? I'm a very nice person. Why would they stab me? And this lady said, I am so bored. Nobody ever comes to visit me. Nobody talks to me. None of the staff pay any attention to me. So I thought, if I stabbed you, this would get me some attention. I said, thanks a lot. I still have the scar. And then the other thing I remember was, again, they still believed that light was bad for people who had mental issues. So the lights were kept low, and they would line them all up in the aisle, and they would just sit there all day.
Wow.
So it was horrible. That's one of the reasons why, and many of you probably have had to think about this. When my mother was, 95, she fell, she hurt herself, she needed to go into long-term care. Something inside me died when I had to put her into a place. Now, the place where we put her was the best place we could find, and it was generally considered to be one of the best places out there. But it just broke my heart to do it, because it's just I wouldn't want that. I mean, my mother stayed at home all those years in her own home. She lived in her own home for 72 years because she had the fear of ever having to go into a place like that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I know that's not historical, but it's the reality of what life is like.
Thank you, Richard, for the answer.
Okay, so everybody's happy. So we'll see you on Wednesday, hopefully. A lot of you on Wednesday. Thank you, and I have recorded this, so I will, like all the rest of them, I will put it on to the internet, so anybody who missed it and may want to see it, they can go on to the History Hound and take a look. And while you're on the internet today, by now they should have published my article. I do an article every weekend on Newmarket Today, so the article should already have been published. Although I know that it's getting later and later because I think Kim and Deborah from Newmarket today are just working out of their minds, trying to keep up with the virus and all the new breaking news.
Yeah.
So it may not be, but hopefully it has been. Anyway, have a great day.
Thank you,
Take care.
Richard.
Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you can hear. I can still hear you. How are you?
Oh, hi. I didn't know how to talk, but my grandfather in Glasgow, he died it was the seniors. It was one of they used to call it, there they called it the poor's house, not the poor's
Hey,
house. And you could actually see it from their window. They lived in an apartment, and you
right.
could way in the distance. And they used to, this is when, I guess it was a hospital then, it was called Forest Hall. But I don't think my grandfather would have wanted to end his days in there. But it just so happened, family had moved away, people didn't have room, and he was at the stage he needed to be taken care of. And it was unfortunate he ended up in Forest Hall. And I think he would have been, if he had known that, he would have been really embarrassed. He was a working man all of his life.
Oh, for sure.
To have ended up in the place called Forest Hall, although it was a nursing home by the time he was there. But it was very interesting. I really enjoyed your presentation, and
Well, thank you. Thank you.
I'll look forward to your one on Wednesday. I'll make sure I'll put I'll put something on my phone to remind me, because I think I forgot about the one on Wednesday till after it was over. But I'll put a reminder on my phone that it's going to be on Wednesday. So thank you very much,
Well, I appreciate you coming.
and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Stay well.
Bye.